Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. A little bit different ways to do things, but I think we have to get used to it for the coming few weeks, or actually more, because I think one thing we'll see that we will not go back to what we used to be before this situation. Like this coronavirus crisis is basically like accelerating, I think, some trends that were happening anyway. And that's what we're going to talk about today from my angle, which is empowering people to create their own tools. Before I jump into this, though, just a few words about me, and I'll try to go pretty quickly on this, but I'm originally from France, even though I left my home country about 15 years ago now, so it's been quite some time. Started a little bit with a stunt in Japan, then I was in China for almost 4 years in management consulting, which led me to business school in the US, and I stayed in the US after school. And I started Bubble, the company that I'm running today, in 2012, so right after school. And we're probably the first no-code tool of the new era. I'm saying this because some people have tried to solve, and I'll get into this in a few minutes, actually. Some people have tried to solve the no-code problem like for 30 or 40 years, but there is a new wave of tools that has taken shape over the last 3-4 years. And in fact, in 2012, we kind of started that wave. So we're earlier than other people on the market. And so what Bubble is today, just in a few words, it's a visual programming language or a no-code tool, depending on how you want to call it, that lets people build web applications without writing code. It's probably the most advanced tool in terms of how complicated or powerful the application you can do. On the flip side, that means there is a little bit more of a learning curve, which is why we call ourselves more visual programming, because it's still about programming and there's still some work to build things, but you do that with your mouse and clicking instead of typing code. In practice, people use this mostly to either start their own companies without a technology tech resources, so a tech co-founder, or hiring an engineering team remotely, or outsourced, or to build their own tools, which is actually a lot what we're going to talk about today for existing companies. So my view on what's going on right now and the push for remote work because of the confinement is going to make technology even more ubiquitous. And when I talk about that, I don't necessarily just say, as Maud was saying, we're going to have to start, managing people remotely. It's also like effectively all our interactions with others and with the work that we do will be driven by technology. And that causes a very important issue to me, which is still today, very few people can actually create the tools that everybody can use. And there is a clear distinction today between people that create technology and people that consume it. If you want to be a little bit like extreme, you're going to say it's a few thousand young people in California, sometime in other places like Paris, or New York, or Berlin, but effectively mostly California, building the tools that billions of people use to work, and even in the personal setting, whether it's dating, communicating, and all these things. And to me, this is one of the biggest challenges that technology will have to solve, because it is very unhealthy to have a few thousand people basically creating the tools that everybody uses. And to be fair, so we need to break this, and to be fair, as I was saying a little bit earlier, we're not necessarily the first people trying to solve no code. It's a hard problem, so it's not been solved yet. But since the early days of technology, it's already been about, empowering more people to do more simply. If you think about, what happened, in the 80s, when we went from MS-DOS, I would let people, use computers by typing code. So effectively, you had to code just to edit the text. Then Windows and Macintosh were there, and suddenly, you didn't have to write code anymore to do things. You would just, use your mouse and click everywhere to do things. And pretty much immediately, the adoption of computing has gotten like dramatically bigger, and we ended up having, computers in, I think Bill Gates used to say, every office and every living room in the world. And what we're trying to do with no code, and what we think is very important by empowering people to create technology, is to accelerate this adoption even more at a time, again, where technology is more ubiquitous, and the need for people to create their own thing is actually more important, because trusting just, again, a few thousand people to create all the things we're going to be using is not going to be working very well. So why, building a little bit on that, why is it important? So remote work happened digitally, and even trying to get outside of the remote thing, everything going forward will happen digitally. And the tools that you can find on the market are really exactly what you need. Like every company is different. In fact, if you look at software spending in the world, custom software growth 3 times faster than generic software, like software you would buy on a SaaS basis, which means that companies are actually very much aware of that, and they're willing to put more money to build custom tools because they know that custom tools is actually what they need for their companies. And they can do that when they're very big companies, but we need to enable everyone to do this. And the second reason why this is an important problem to let people build their tools themselves is that because business situations are changing faster and faster, and you need tools that can really adjust in real time. And by definition, if you buy something built by someone else, that's going to be, so outsourcing that to an external team is going to be pretty slow to get something that will evolve fast enough for your situation. And I think what we've seen over the last 3 weeks, when you think of where we were, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, and where we are today, like the change of what the world looks like today is probably one of the fastest change we've seen in history. And that leads, companies to very troubled times because they need to adjust very quickly. And again, that's where it is very important to empower people to create their own tools, because otherwise you end up having tools that you're going to have to adapt to the tools instead of having the tools adapting to your situation, which is pretty dangerous and actually destroys a lot of value. So our solution to this, there have been many ways. I mean, all the problems that I've just listed earlier and why it's important, most people agree with that, to be fair. Where people disagree a little bit more in, what do we do to make it work for people? A lot of people have thought that, teaching everyone how to build things by writing code was the right solution. I think it's a little bit behind us, but it's what people would say, in 2013, 2014. And it went for about 3-4 years where, there was some craziness around learning how to code. If you think, all the boot camps that were appearing everywhere in the world, that's actually when that started. And then there is another approach, which today is more popular, but I can tell you that when we started in 2012, it was not popular at all. We were kind of the one, thinking that the learning how to code thing would work, is to change the tools that people can use to create things and do that without code, so that non-engineers can build their own thing themselves. And so very practically, what that means is, using a visual interface of some kind to build the application you need. And again, this is not something new. I want to reiterate that because sometimes people see that as a revolutionary thing. And it is if you look at the last 10 years of technology, but this is really what people have tried to do for the last 30 years. Apple has it shot in the 80s, with HyperCard. Microsoft tried and spent a lot of that actually with, front page, Visual Basic. Microsoft Access in some ways was a no-code tool. It's really something that companies have always tried to do, but technologies so far have evolved faster than the tools, which made those tools outdated pretty quickly, which is why today people are not using these tools anymore, like, for instance, Access. So the recent wave, and now I think finally no-code has found a way to get powerful enough for people to actually build real things. And I'll get to what that means in a few minutes with a few examples. So that now we can say that I think no code will eventually win, which was not obvious 10 to 15 years ago, in the sense that in the future, we're going to have non-technical people being able to build their own tools themselves. It's still going to take you some time, but it's going to be much faster, much more people will be able to do it. And it's going to be faster to build than writing code, because in practice, once you get to learn those tools a little bit, you'll see that it's a higher level of abstraction, which means you can create something like a simple version of a marketplace, for instance, or a simple version of a CRM would take probably a couple of days to build. That's where an engineer would actually take much longer to build this. So why is no-code a winning strategy? Actually, I touched that a little bit already. Is writing code fundamentally is expensive and slow. It's expensive because not many people can do it. So the salaries you have to pay for to get code written are really high. And so another way to see why no code is better than writing code is because it makes technology dramatically cheaper. Like you can actually do much more at a much cheaper cost. Then the second reason why this is something very promising, back to people need to build their own tools, is what you see in traditional software development is that some people facing a situation or a problem or trying to launch something to the world are going to start, usually non-technical people. So it's usually business people or people that are very much of a interacting with customers on a very recurring, frequent basis. they're going to define what people should be building, and the engineers is most of the time, only transcribing what they're trying to, what the other person is ordering, essentially. And that leads to pretty often, lost in translation issues. And I think if you were to do a survey on software outsourcing, even if it's in the same company, you would see that, 90% of the time, what you end up receiving from the engineers is not what you had in mind. And so if you start, transferring the power to create to people that actually have the issues and face the issues and try to solve them with software, they'll be able to actually build exactly what they have in mind without this loss and translation issues, which destroys value, makes people lose time and a lot of back and forth. And it most of the time, ends up to something that will never be exactly what the initial need was about. And the second reason, other reasons why this is a winning approach, I think, and that's why the market forces will make us, will make no-code win eventually, is, as I was saying, it's faster to build, so it's cheaper to build on no-code, but also you increase the pool of people that can build on those tools by a factor or probably 100. A question I get often is, what kind of, how to say, technical skill do you need to use something like Bubble or other no-code tools? And usually the answer I would give is, if someone is Excel smart, which means if someone has been trained to use, productivity tools like PowerPoint and Excel, they are able to program. So if you think about the impact that we're talking about here, we're talking about, going from like a few, I don't know, in the US, we probably have, a few hundred of thousand a year, people a year that can write code. We're moving into probably something like, a few million or 10 million people that basically graduate out of schools, but not technical schools, that can suddenly become as powerful and efficient as software engineers, which again drives the cost of software creation by a factor of, down by a factor of probably 50 to 100, which makes that, people can build more things faster for their own need. The last good thing about this approach, which is not a direct effect, but it's actually something I personally am the most excited about, is that effectively, if no-code technologies win eventually, this is going to free a ton of engineers to actually do more interesting things in the world. If I wanted to be provocative, an example I use pretty frequently is Lyft and Uber. So for people that don't live in the US, Lyft is basically the same as Uber, except that it's pink instead of being black. But effectively, those ride-sharing companies are exactly the same companies in terms of the technical product they offer. They have different business practices, sometimes different pricing, sometimes different branding. Like the way they get to market is different. But fundamentally, the app that people interact with on their phone, it's really just about changing the colors and changing a little bit where the different things are. And when you think that these companies have thousands of engineers basically working on similar product, is a really sad thing for the world, because what that means is these engineers that are very qualified and could do very interesting things are basically reinventing the wheel and replicating what other people are doing, instead of working on something truly innovative that I don't know what that could do, but that could potentially have a much more deep impact on the world. Whether, I don't know, something healthcare, which is a fashionable thing to talk about these days, environment concern. There are so many things where people could be using code to solve problems. And so if we manage to increase the pool of people that can build things and make things build faster, engineers effectively will stop working on these things that can be replicated with no-code tools pretty quickly, and we'll start working on other things. And that's like a secondary effect of the no-code revolution, which I think is one of the most interesting, because it's going to free a ton of time to people so they can work on more interesting things. I'm starting to see some people in the chat saying that Lyft would be mad if they heard that they are like Uber. Yeah, I know. But again, I'm not saying they're the same companies. They are the same software. And that's actually something quite important to notice. If I wanted to be even more provocative, I would say companies like, these companies that are pretty similar, HomeAway and Airbnb and stuff like that, to me, are not truly software companies. They are software empowered, software enabled companies. And which, to be fair, is probably 90% of startups today are not true technology. Today, when you say deep tech, I think that means technology companies. Bubble is a technology company, we create software. Airbnb or Lyft are like a hospitality or transportation business. Just happens that in 2021 or 2020 or 2012 when they started, or a little bit earlier, it happened through a software medium. And because it happens happening through a software medium, they developed as software technology platforms. But because of that, that means what they're doing, at least in the early years, when you start scaling, it's a little bit different. They should be able to do that without code, and again, free engineering time to do more interesting things. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I already built on that quite a bit already, but the different things that I mentioned earlier are the reason why we think empowering non-technical people to build things is the best approach to solve the fundamental rift that you have between people that create technology and people that use it. And more fundamentally, what we mention often as a social issue as computer literacy. Otherwise, we're going to move into a world where, again, a few thousand of people or like tens of thousands of people will be the one creating the tools and capturing a lot of, the creation power and the wealth that come with it. And we'll have literally millions of people that will not be able to contribute as much in the new society. And back to the topic we talked about with remote work and, what we're seeing like this week, effectively, people that are not technology literate today are struggling a lot to survive in these weeks. Governments are doing what they can, to help them. But since this is a long-term trend, and we're not going to go back to where we were today, we need to find a different way than just supporting them from a government like social benefit standpoint. We need to change the tools to empower them to do things themselves. So just to give you a couple of examples of how people are leveraging no-code technologies today, and then I'll hope we can open to Q&A. I see some people that already posted a few things on the chat. I'll show a few examples of what we've seen recently on the platform, on Bubble. One that is actually very timely because it literally happened last week. And this is a way to illustrate how fast it can go to build things and how you can react very quickly to new situations happening. We had this, he's a very long-time user. I think he started using us in 2014, but about last weekend, he saw an opportunity to help local restaurants in the US by creating a platform where people could buy gift cards in advance, which is a way for restaurants that are obviously very badly hit by the situation, the confinement, to sell gift cards that people would use, maybe 6 months from now, where you can start walking around again in the street. I don't know if France has already done something like this, but it's a good way basically to optimize the cash flows of restaurants so that they don't shut down and fire everyone while they have to wait for the confinement to be over. And so this person created this platform, which is basically a web application. Started it like last Friday or last Thursday, or last Saturday. He launched it on Tuesday, and it got viral in the US. The guy found a way to get on the Zagat mailing list, which is Google service for restaurant reviews, and it got acquired by USA Today on March 21. So you can see how fast it can go. An engineer would have, it could happen with a very good engineer to do this, but here the person that did that is actually non-technical, and he saw an opportunity, had to move very fast on that, and that no-code technologies have like Bubble in this case has enabled it to launch something extremely quickly to get from nothing to national attention and an acquisition in literally 4 days. So this is an example. I mean, in this case, it was not structured as a company, but you could see that as a startup. What we see a lot, and in the context of people building their own tools is even more relevant, is because each company is different and each company needs customization. About 30% of the apps built on Bubble are actually for internal usage, internal tools. So those are not applications that are meant to be public with a custom domain name and with people would start acquiring users for the service. Those are more applications where you have maybe like 50 users, or depending on how big your company is, where you're going to build custom solutions because you're not satisfied with that the generic SaaS product on the market offer. So effectively, what we've seen is product management tools, CRMs. We saw someone rebuilding like an entire business suite from HR to inventory, purchasing, and invoicing. And instead of using something on the market, decided to invest I think it's in Canada, HVAC company, like a AC supply company. I think they spent about 2 weeks to build an entirely custom suite, which basically cost them 2 weeks of a non-technical person. So it's actually pretty cheap if you put that in comparison with how much it would cost to hire a tech shop to do this. And they end up building something that is exactly the kind of things they need. Like the button is exactly where people expect it to be because they talk to their users, the users being in the same office, to make sure that this is something that would be very user-friendly for people. And the metric that I use to illustrate that, which I already mentioned, is custom software spendings grow 3 times faster than the overall SaaS industry in the world, which when you think of all the people that say, you know, the world is moving into more and more SaaS product to solve like each different problems that you might have in the world, it's actually counterintuitive. Like customization is here to stay, and people are willing to throw a lot of money at this to try to get customized software. Not effectively today, because the building process for software is pretty slow and tedious. But with better technologies, the market is actually going to grow much faster. And the last thing we've seen, and that's actually probably the most heartwarming situation that we're seeing right now, is again, because building your own tools with no-code technology is much faster and cheaper, because effectively it's investing your own time, a few hours, you can launch something. We've seen a lot of increase of usage over the last 2 weeks with people building side projects to try to get passive income. Like, this is especially true in a country like the US, where the social protection is not as strong as in Europe. And so we start seeing some people that are basically, you know, left without, like, that take a big income cut over the last 2 weeks. And so, again, reacting to the new situation with something fast and something within some new tools to adapt to the situation. We've seen a lot of people trying to start side projects to make a passive income, whether in some kind of marketplace or some kind of SaaS tools that they would distribute on a subscription basis to try to go through the situation in a little bit easier fashion. And my guess is that this is actually something that's going to keep going. So this trend, you know, people having product on the side, so freelance world, which doesn't necessarily mean you're not full-time employees, that means you do something in addition, is something that will be accelerated by what we're going through right now, and that is not going to go back to where it used to be before. And yeah, so that's kind of what I want to finish on before, you know, going for questions, is in many ways what we're going through right now feels extraordinary. It is. The way it happened is extraordinary. Like, this push for like everybody being at home, working remotely is new, but it's basically accelerating some things that was necessary, that have been necessary for the last, you know, 20 years or something, but just was not as obvious. And there will be no going back to where we used to be before. And instead, you know, the need for solving the problem we're trying to solve with no code will be more and more acute. I do think the no-code approach is a winning one. I think we'll start having a very clear view of that in the next 2 years. Things are going to go pretty quickly now. And thank you very much. And now I can start taking some questions. So I see Anne-France, how do Bubble client protect the IP? I'm reading. This is a question we get all the time. It's actually not like, you know, when you build something on our platform, you own your design, you own your data, you own, you know, the different workflows that describe how the application works. If people are curious, I could show what the platform looks like. I actually have a little animated GIF that shows how that works. And that's very much your IP, and you keep it. You know, like, there's nothing we own here. It's a little bit like, you know, saying if you write a book on Microsoft Word, you own the book, but Microsoft Word owns the way to read the file. In practice, we've seen actually people trying to protect that with the lawyers. I mean, you can patent anything, not patent, but you can register anything you want. It's up to you to do that. In practice, we've never had issues with people being in trouble in their business negotiations, thinking that they wouldn't own the IP.
Do you want to show the little GIF, maybe of your project, so that people can see how it looks?
Yeah, so that's what you see here. So it's very much like a PowerPoint type interface, you know, like you start dragging and dropping where you want to build, and then you define which is where you see now, and this is a loop, so you're going to see it again. These workflows, which is a way to say when the user clicks on this button, do this, do this, do that. So the fundamental idea here is not revolutionary. I think what we've done better than what has been done so far is we took the time. I mean, it's been 8 years, so it takes a long time to get, you know, to the right depth of features to cover most use cases. And we find, like, I think a pretty good level between, you know, a lot of control without code, and letting people build these things, you know, action by action, describing what the application does. So what that would be, for instance, would be, you know, when the user clicks on save, you're going to save an entry in the database, charge a credit card, send an email, change the page. And we've pre-built those things. And where it starts becoming very interesting, and that's why I'm not always a fan of the no-code denomination that I didn't coin. It's something that came from the press and I think investors, is you can actually add code if needed. behind those things that you think the workflow, the screen here, the different actions, you can actually write code if something is missing, and that's why it's becoming very powerful, because engineers are still part of this. But again, instead of reinventing the wheels, they're just going to contribute for the new things that's missing and make it available to non-technical people to use them.
So we have a couple of questions about the internal tools. Indeed, it's incredible. So do you have some examples of impressive projects that have been built through Bubble, or maybe examples, as Garance is asking, examples of internal tools that have been built to foster remote work or just team communications?
So the most complicated thing I've seen, to be honest, it's a little bit harder to track for us because it's much easier for us to track public-facing products, obviously. The most complicated thing I've seen is the one I mentioned in Canada, where they basically replaced the HR, finance, invoicing, purchasing, inventory management tools with one big app built on us. So, I mean, honestly, it's as complicated as it can get. It depends on each business situation, but in terms of, the amount of things a suite that they've built covers, it's as wide as you can get. What I've seen lately, so before talking today, I had a little bit of a look at some kind of use cases that we were seeing over the last 2-3 weeks. So a lot of things around product management. People mention a lot, Notion as a way to communicate better with their team and stuff like that. But again, this is something coming from the outside world that says this is how you should be interacting with your team, and please use it. And instead, we saw people using like a PM tool, which at the end of the day, it's always you create a task and people can comment on what their share of the work is. But the workflow is always a little bit different, and it's very it can seem to be minor, but if you have a team, it's actually very important. Does that step happen before the next communication, or should it be the other way around? Those things from a software standpoint don't seem that different, but they actually can be highly disruptive for your team if you don't have the right flow. And so what we've seen, it's probably the most common use case right now for internal tools, is project management platforms where people, collaborate on something, but just the way they communicate, and the way they communicate is always by adding comments. Basically, sometimes, if they want to integrate with something like Slack, they can, so that it goes to other platforms. But effectively, it's always, adding comments at the right time to a project. It's just the flow is a little bit different each time. The most impressive things we've seen on the platform, just to add on that, again, are usually more external facing, which is probably 70% of our use case today. It's 70% external, 30% internal. And then it's much easier to talk about it because those are public information. And there are usually some metrics attached that people are familiar with when it's about judging how impressive something is, which means how much money they've raised, the sales and stuff like this. Paris actually, like one of the biggest startups in Paris, like Comet, was started on us a while back. Like, it's a freelancing platform built initially in Bubble, and I think they're actually coming back to use us now, which is a good testimonial of that technology is not just to start, but also something you can use when you've raised money and be at scale. And in the US, we had like a few YC companies that are still running on us today after getting in the accelerator that started on non-technical tools, non-coding tools, no-code tools like Bubble.
And speaking of Comet, obviously they're based in Paris, they're French. You live in the US, you work in the US. Do you see any difference in terms of mindset or cultural differences when it comes to feeling empowered to build your own tools? Do you feel like in the US they feel maybe less, they have less to rely on technical people to build things, or is there?
I mean, France is actually our third market.
The third market, okay, interesting.
After the US and the UK. I think a little bit because of the fact that I'm French, and so we got a little bit more coverage in the early days, and then we reached in Paris some kind of like critical mass. It's fair to say, though, and this has to change, that America tends to be early adopters for those things. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, things, and the fact that the platform is started here, the fact that it's in English, there are a lot of things that make that America tends to go a little bit earlier. I think I can see the gap, getting smaller now. So the rest of the world is definitely catching up. China is actually going pretty quickly on this. Yeah. But in general, America tends to be a little bit faster at adopting these things for now.
Interesting. Okay. So we have another question from Thibaut. He says, let's say our team has been crafting an internal tool with Bubble and it works great, but at some point they need to step on an issue that cannot be solved by Bubble. Is this even possible? Because you mentioned that we could code the missing parts.
Right. So yes, I mean, if something is missing, you can extend the platform. You can't really you can't really generate code out of something built on us. I mean, it's a little bit against what we think. I mean, we think fundamentally we think there is too much code in the world, and each line of code is costly to maintain, and so we don't generate code. So it's not like you're going to take something and run it somewhere else. We've made a public commitment, and I'll reiterate that today, that if we go out of business one day for whatever reason, we'll open source everything so people will be able to run their own version of Bubble on their own servers. But if you can't really take something and run it somewhere else. Now, you can get your data out as much as you want. You can recreate it. It's pretty costly, to be honest. So in practice, we don't see too many people leaving the platform, and instead, they're going to work on adding the missing parts with an engineer, which is a much more cost-efficient way to do. It's a question we get less and less. I mean, that's the kind of things that just scale will help solving, because the bigger you get, the less worried people are that you might disappear, and the more they're okay having something on the current platform. How do you incentivize developers to do some tasks via no-code tools? So by developers, I assume you would mean coders, actually, people that would write code. So each platform has its own approach. Our approach is it's pretty simple and pretty traditional. We have a marketplace. Yeah, I'll talk about the last point in a second. It's a marketplace, so if people build things, they can actually just sell them to the marketplace. And we have today, I think, 6 or 7 companies that are full-time on Bubble and make an entire living for the employees through Bubble plugins, Bubble templates, a lot of things through our ecosystem, and that works pretty well. So Thibaut is actually adding that and say it sounds a little bit captive. Yeah, but I mean, you're captive from Apple. If you build something in AWS, you're basically captive. You can, try to get your own servers, set them up. I know the OVH is going to try to do things there, but in practice, captive is not necessarily a bad thing. It's the platform behind the tool is not evil. And it's something you need to have your true north and make sure that you're not doing something bad. But effectively, until we open source, and I think one day we will, to be honest, but you don't want to do that too soon, because that would, I think, harm the project badly. Because if you open source too soon and you don't have the economics that sustain the business, no one will actually do the work. In practice, it's less of a problem that you think from users that use us. And we have people that have created businesses that are financially very important. Our biggest success story financially is a business that has processed over $1 billion of business volume of sales, through a Bubble built platform. I guess you could say they are captive, but in practice, they're very happy and they're not moving away anytime soon. I see Anne-France is mentioning Contournement in Paris. So they've not copied Bubble at all. They're teaching Bubble. It's a very different relationship. I know them pretty well. They're basically teaching no-code tools and Bubble in particular. So it's not a software company, it's an education entity that teaches no-code.
And I guess it's also a whole movement, right? The no-code. So it's only fair that there are different companies that are just emerging and trying to solve the issue.
Yeah, when we started in 2012, we were the only one. People thought we were very crazy because everybody would learn how to code. In 2016, people started realizing that learning how to code is not necessarily the solution to everything. And so we started emerging a few more companies. And then Webflow, which is the other bigger player in the space, started, I think, in 2013, with a little bit of a different approach, though. So for a long time, it was just the two of us, and now we have probably 6, 7 players, I think, in the space, most of them being more recent. And because you have all those different companies, that each tool is going to have a little bit similar spirit but different details, you have a lot of education companies that have started to help evangelize, and that's what Contournement is doing in Paris, for instance.
All right. And do you have any integrations that work with Bubble? What we can combine, it with?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, pretty much anything.
Anything? Okay. Well,
anything that is REST API for the more technical people in the audience. So anything that exposes an API can be connected with us. That is another answer I have to the captive point of Thibault, which is it's one thing to tell people that if they want to keep running their applications, they have to keep running on you guys, on us. But each application built on us exposes an API, so any other service could talk with it. We can talk with any other service that exposes an API, and you can export data. So in practice, no one uses Bubble as a standalone piece. And this is not necessarily relevant for internal tools, but if you do customer-facing stuff, you're probably going to want at some point to monetize and have a Stripe integration. Well, that's what the integration, like we can connect with Stripe very easily for like credit card processing, for instance, which is done via an API thing. Yeah. One of the most frequent requests we're having right now, because for some reasons, because of this remote thing, Slack usage went through the roof, is being able to authenticate with Slack, for instance. That's something that comes automatically out of the box once you add the Slack plugin.
Nice. And coming back to the remote topic, is that something you are already familiar with?
As a company, me personally?
Both.
Actually, no. So we're not full remote, obviously. We actually started a little bit earlier than other people. We started going full remote 3 weeks ago, which in the US was actually quite early. We're like 10 days earlier than everybody else. And it's new for us because we're not a remote company. In practice, it's fine. I mean, we're learning. It just means having people that are more used to writing their questions instead of asking them live, more used to documenting things in a written fashion instead of like speaking live. But effectively, I mean, tech companies are the most, are the best prepared for this transition. Because again, like, being remote means being very familiar with technology and being with tools, and people at startups or tech companies know those tools better. It's that's one of the sad thing I think of what's going on right now, is that this is going to increase, the rift between people that are part of the new way to do things versus the others. And sadly, socially, where you're going to see that it's mostly like young people from like pretty good backgrounds that are going to be benefiting from this, which is precisely why I think no code is important, because it's a way to narrow that gap again. Otherwise, I'm actually quite worried about what will happen.
Sure, and empower people that wouldn't be empowered otherwise with the technical knowledge. So are you thinking about building any internal tool for the Bubble team now that you're experiencing the remote more intensely? And I don't know, are you discovering new issues?
So we do. I mean, we do a lot of dog fooding. So what that means, in English, is we use our own tools to solve our own things. So first of all, our own platform is built on Bubble, but internally, all our our own CRM, our own product management tools are being built on the platform. And our PM, who's actually the one owning these two products, is probably spending a third of his time right now iterating on this, because we're discovering new things that we didn't think about because we're all in the same office. And so the fact that now we're all remote, the products that we're using built on Bubble are actually getting quite different. But again, that's the beauty of the thing. If we had an engineer do that, that would probably take like 4 weeks or something. Here, you can like make the changes in the app he's building like in a couple of hours.
Nice.
And it's much cheaper.
Sorry, you said?
And it's much cheaper to have a non-technical person to do that than an engineer.
Yeah, that makes a huge difference.
It's a salary question. Yeah.
Interesting. Yes. Which is a huge issue in the US, also not only in the US, but especially in the US.
Yeah, in the US in particular, everywhere.
Yeah. All right, guys. Do you have any other question about anything, the no-code movement, Bubble in the product, but the use case that Emmanuel introduced? Oh, yes, we have another question from Thibault. That is a long question.
So I mean, each case is a little bit. So the question, just to read it live, is really how do you convince the engineers, in particular on the team, that they should be okay with this new way to do things, effectively, basically. I mean, each case is a little bit different here, each company. In practice, engineers are skeptical people, like they're skeptics. I am an engineer, so, you know, what defines a good engineer is to usually not be, oh yeah, that's so great, is to find the problems first. But at the end of the day, if you show them something that works, they'll be like, okay, I guess it's working. And then they'll see that, you know, if you can actually do that even faster than they would themselves, then at some point they have no other thing to say that, okay, yeah, I can envision many problems, but I guess it works. In practice, so I was talking about Comet earlier, you know, they started on us, hired a CTO, a team of engineers, raised a lot of money, and now they're actually coming back, and Charles was telling me that the engineer is actually happy because they get to not do a lot of the boring stuff. Because again, no code is never going to replace code completely. That's something that I want to make very clear and explicit. It's going to replace code for, and then we can argue on the percentage, but probably 90% of things today that require code. So there's still going to be 10% of things that you should still write code. So for instance, if you're writing like, you know, optimization using machine learning, you're not going to do that with a no-code tool. So effectively, no-code tools will let the engineers focus on the more interesting things. And usually better engineers enjoy working on more complicated problems. And then you keep, you know, the easier stuff, which is a major chunk. Again, I think it's 80 to 90% of what they do today with different tools. And then the last thing I'd say, at the more macro level, it's going to be a market dynamics thing, to be honest. If you can create the same thing for like 1/50th of the cost, just because it's faster to build and more people can do it, it doesn't really matter what engineers will say eventually. In a few years, just, you know, because people will want to go for what is cheaper at some point. You know, this businesses all think the same way. No code will win, and engineers will just have to embrace it. In practice, we've seen that, by the way. When we started in 2012, none of our, between 2012 and 2015, none of our users were technical, like no one. Today, it's probably, you know, 10 to 15% of our users have a computer science background. And they use us in addition with code. So they code the interesting part, and they use Bubble for the less interesting part, which is usually, you know, building the database, the CRUD operations, the UI of the product, and that share of the 15% keeps going up, actually. But it is necessary for us to solve that eventually. If engineers don't buy in at some point, then it's going to be a problem, because they're usually the gatekeepers in companies. Like, they are the one controlling what technology is used. But I'm pretty optimistic.
All right, so Salome is asking, do people use the no-code tools like Bubble to create passive incomes? Yes, that's definitely something you mentioned. Do you have
definitely
example?
I mean, it's usually when it's SaaS, when it's passive income, it's usually automation products, you know, like workflow automation products that they sell on a SaaS basis. In practice, I think it's pretty hard to do. We see three kind of use cases on Bubble, roughly, for like the external facing, like people starting companies on top of us. Is going to be marketplaces, social networks, or SaaS automation, you know, like automating some processes by combining different APIs together, something like this, that you sell on a subscription basis. The first two, in my experience, are pretty hard to do as a side project, because a marketplace or social network requires a lot of work on the growth side, because you need a network effect to make the product succeed. You can actually have of our users just launched like a simpler invoicing tool for freelancers, for instance, that is a little bit easier to use as the alternative. You don't necessarily need to work. If you don't try to make something huge with it, you can just let it there, have some ads on Google, or just try to get into some communities of freelancers, and that doesn't require too much maintenance. And those are much better for passive income. Yep.
Very cool. And Thibaut is telling, as an engineer, I'd love to have how you can integrate no-code tools built by your team in your existing infrastructure, apps, etc. To be 100% okay telling my team to use it. Yeah, I mean, that's a fair comment. Does it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a content question. Thibaut is basically asking for better content here, which we should do. In practice, though, I mean, the technical response is, I'll give it now, which is, given that a bubble app can talk to any service that exposes an API and that a bubble app exposes an API, that's how you can really integrate them very quickly, if you know how to code. But we should make that content a little bit more explicit. It's something that will come over time. Now that we're in a phase where people start scaling more and more on us, we're going to see more and more cases like Comet where people start being non-technical and they bring an engineering team, and then to blend will have to happen at that point. So it's something that will naturally happen, I think, over the next year.
Interesting. Okay. Is there any other, because you mentioned Comet, is there any other very well-known startups that have been built through Bubble, or maybe, I guess there are, a lot of them are American, we don't necessarily know them?
I mean, you know, there are a lot of companies, a lot of startups.
Yeah.
So I don't know what a very well-known startup is, and I think it's Airbnb. And I wish, you know, Airbnb were built on us, but it's not yet. The next one, I think another company that people might be familiar with, both in France and the US, actually is Plato, which is like started by a French team, but they're now based in San Francisco, and it's a platform to help. It's a very Silicon Valley thing to help junior engineers find mentors among more senior engineers, and so they match basically people for mentoring sessions. So they basically, when I said, you know, of the 3 use cases, you know, marketplaces, social networks, or SaaS product like automation, workflow automation product, that's very much the kind of social network that you have. And so they went through, they started in Paris, French team, they went to YC, and they're doing pretty well now in San Francisco. And they basically monetize and, you know, charging more junior people looking for mentors. So it's like career development type of services. And they've not built their main product on us because they started before knowing about us, but while at YC, we have a lot of YC companies that use us because we're part of the toolbox there. And they build the entire backend where they match people with no-code tools.
That's a good example.
So I think it's Plato HQ.
Okay, nice.
I think.
We'll have a look.
I mean, our biggest success in the US last week in terms of attention was the guy that got acquired by USA Today. I mean,
yeah, this example is very impressive.
And that was
Thanks, Vlad,
success, yeah.
for the link to Plato, so you can all have a look. And yeah, this example was really impressive. All right, do you have any other question, guys? Just allowing a few seconds in case some of you are typing. Yeah, and so in any case, if you want to follow up later on with additional question, Emmanuel, if you want to drop your email.
Yeah, to reach out. I mean, you can see it on the screen right now. Like pretty traditionally, Emmanuel at bubble.io. I'm also on Twitter. People send a lot of messages on LinkedIn. It's not always easy to follow up on all of them, but you know, that's
cool. So yeah, here we
option.
go. Emmanuel at bubble.io. All right. Thank you, Emmanuel. It was great. Very interesting. We don't hear about that topic as much as we should. Thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, just stay around for the rest of the talks. Bye, guys. Que la famille.